You won't believe what happened next. Valentina, the rich Mafia wife, loses control in a restaurant and tears Eva's shirt in public. But when Enzo, her Mafia husband, sees everything, his fury is unstoppable. I watch the full drama unfold. It's intense, shocking, and you won't see the ending coming. Like, share, and subscribe to catch more unbelievable stories every day. Eva Carter's mornings never began with the luxury of comfort. The first rays of dawn had barely kissed the city streets when she was already awake, peeling herself from the thin sheets of the modest apartment she shared with her younger brother, Sam. The small kitchenette was barely functional. The chipped tiles on the floor told stories of neglect and time, while the single faucet dripped relentlessly, like a clock ticking down her limited moments of rest. Coffee wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity, bitter and black, the kind that jolted her mind awake and made her forget for a moment the constant ache in her shoulders. Her life wasn't glamorous. Eva worked as a waitress at La Rosa, a mid-range restaurant tucked in the bustling heart of the city. She loved the work in a way that surprised even her. There was something satisfying in orchestrating a symphony of orders, making sure each customer felt cared for and moving quickly yet gracefully across the crowded tables. But it wasn't the tip of the day that made the job exhausting. It was the weight of indifference, judgment, and sometimes outright cruelty that came with serving strangers who saw her not as a person, but as an accessory to their dining experience. The restaurant was alive with personalities. Chef Jorge was loud but kind, his booming voice always cutting through the clatter of plates and chatter. The younger staff often leaned on Eva for guidance, knowing she handled stress with a quiet resilience they hadn't yet learned. She was the anchor, the one who reminded them how to stay calm under pressure, how to move with efficiency, yet empathy. Despite her modest demeanor, she exuded a quiet strength that didn't go unnoticed. Even with all her effort, her wages barely kept her and Sam afloat. Bills piled up, groceries stretched thin, and yet she never let the fatigue show. She knew that behind her resilience lay a promise to herself and her brother. They would survive, thrive even, no matter what. Each day began and ended with the same mantra: keep moving forward no matter what. It was during these long, grueling hours at La Rosa that she first noticed him. Not in a way that made her life chaotic or intrusive, but in a subtle, almost invisible way, Enzo Romano. He wasn't just another customer. He was a man of distinction, dressed sharply, with an air of authority that made people instinctively step aside. Yet, despite the quiet power he carried, there was something unexpectedly attentive in the way he observed the world around him. He came often enough that Eva recognized the sound of his shoes clicking against the wooden floor, the soft murmur of his greetings to the staff, the way he appreciated details others ignored. Enzo was familiar with La Rosa, not just because it was a nice place to dine. It was a place where he could observe, reflect, and in his own private way, admire. He noticed Eva early on, not because of her looks, though she was undeniably striking with her expressive eyes and gentle smile, but because of how she carried herself. In a room full of complaints, chaos, and entitlement, Eva moved with patience, with grace, and with a warmth that drew people toward her. He admired how she handled even the most difficult customers with tact, how she never let frustration dictate her actions. It was an admiration grounded in respect, nothing more. Enzo wasn't a man given to frivolous affection. His life, entwined with the dangerous legacy of his family, demanded precision and vigilance. Yet, in Eva, he saw something rare: sincerity, dignity, and an unwavering sense of self. Each time he visited, he found himself observing, not leering, not intrusive, but quietly noting how she interacted with the world. A small act of kindness to a frazzled co-worker, a patient explanation to an elderly patron struggling with the menu. Even the little ways she adjusted her apron or wiped down a table with care spoke volumes. Eva's life outside the restaurant was far less forgiving than the controlled chaos of La Rosa. After long shifts, she returned to the cramped apartment she shared with Sam, where they cooked simple meals, shared their day's struggles, and tried to laugh despite the world pressing in on all sides. Sam idolized her, not because she was perfect, but because she was relentless. She was the bridge between exhaustion and hope, the voice that reminded him that they could endure more than most would think possible. Yet Ava carried the weight of unspoken pain. There were days when she wondered if her efforts were enough, if the world would ever recognize her for who she was beyond the roles she was forced to play. Caretaker, waitress, resilient girl in a city that demanded toughness without offering reprieve. And every so often, she felt the unfairness of her position acutely, the subtle snide remarks from wealthier customers, the impatience of those who assumed her life had no complexities, the glaring differences between her reality and that of the privileged few who walked through the restaurant doors. And that's where the tension quietly simmered. While Ava maintained her professionalism, she wasn't immune to frustration. It built like pressure in a storm, invisible until the moment it erupted. And she had seen people behave worse than her, people who thought money or status gave them the right to humiliate others. She had learned to bite her tongue, to let most of it slide, but some days, some provocations, tested her limits. Enzo, meanwhile, remained a silent observer in this complex tapestry. His admiration was subtle, almost imperceptible. When he complimented her service or smiled warmly at her quick wit, it was never inappropriately intimate. It was acknowledgement, recognition of her worth in a world that often overlooked such qualities. He respected boundaries and he respected her. His life demanded discretion, and he knew the dangers of blurring lines. But in Eva, he found a reminder that integrity and grace could still exist in the midst of chaos. It was a mutual awareness rather than a relationship. Eva noticed him too, of course, but not with desire or infatuation. She recognized that he was different, not because he carried wealth or power, but because he carried himself with a quiet composure that matched the respect she held for those who treated life and people with care. She noted his presence, acknowledged it politely, and then moved on with her work. The restaurant itself had its rhythm, its small dramas and triumphs, which Eva navigated with skill honed through years of experience. She understood the balance between appeasing customers and maintaining dignity, between enforcing rules and showing kindness. And it was precisely this balance that had caught Enzo's attention from the beginning. She wasn't swayed by power or influence. She treated everyone according to their merit, not their status. Life, however, had a cruel way of testing patience. On one particular day, as the lunch rush reached its peak, the atmosphere in La Rosa was charged with energy. Orders flew in rapid succession, clattering plates bounced along counters, and the staff worked tirelessly to keep up. Amid this chaos, Eva maintained her composure, guiding junior servers, calming irritated diners, and making sure every dish left the kitchen perfectly. Her movements were precise, almost like a carefully choreographed dance, each step purposeful, each word measured. The city sparkled beneath the early evening sky, a kaleidoscope of lights and shadows reflecting off the slick streets. Valentina Romano stepped out of the sleek black car, the soft hum of the engine fading into the ambient noise of the bustling avenue. She adjusted her designer dress and glanced at Enzo, who was already walking beside her, calm and composed as always. His tailored suit, crisp and immaculate, gave him an air of authority that few could challenge. Yet she noticed his eyes flicker with something almost mischievous, a spark she couldn't quite place. "Where are we going tonight?" Valentina asked, her tone smooth but tinged with curiosity. She always liked to know the details, to control the evening before it even began. But Enzo, as usual, was deliberately vague. "I know a good place," he said, his voice low, deliberate, with the casual confidence that had earned him both respect and fear. "It's quiet, the food is excellent, and the staff..." "Reliable," Valentina raised an eyebrow. "Reliable? You don't usually care about staff. What makes this place different?" Enzo smiled faintly. "It's not about the staff. It's about the environment. I know a waitress there, someone who handles herself well. Polite, efficient, someone who doesn't flatter or pander. I appreciate that." Valentina's eyes narrowed, just slightly, though she masked it with a light laugh. "So you're taking me there because she works there. Are you interested in people like that now?" Her tone was teasing, but there was an undercurrent of sharpness, a hint of the jealousy she had always tried to keep hidden. "Don't be ridiculous," Enzo said smoothly. "I'm taking you there because the place is excellent. The waitress? She's just..."
Competent.
I like people who are competent. Valentina didn't respond immediately. She studied him, noting the slight gleam in his eyes, the calm assurance in the way he carried himself. She felt an unfamiliar prickle of irritation. It wasn't that she doubted him, but that someone else, could draw even a fraction of his attention. Even admiration was intolerable. The ride to the restaurant was quiet after that, save for the occasional music from the radio and the soft hum of the tires against the road. Valentina kept one hand lightly resting on the seat, fingers tapping subtly, while Enzo remained composed, lost in thought. He had planned this evening carefully, not for conflict, but because he appreciated efficiency, quality, and discretion. The last thing he needed was drama, yet the situation had an inevitable tension he couldn't ignore. When they arrived at La Rosa, the familiar warmth of the restaurant's lighting welcomed them. The clatter of dishes, the soft murmur of patrons, and the rich aroma of Italian cuisine combined to create a comfortable chaos that Ava had grown used to. And in the midst of it, Ava moved with quiet precision, her presence a stabilizing force among the flurry of activity. Enzo led Valentina inside, subtly directing the hostess to a quiet corner table that offered a clear view of the main dining area. He made small talk with Valentina as they sat down, commenting on the decor, the ambient music, and the reputation of the restaurant. But even as he spoke, his eyes occasionally flicked toward the floor, searching for a familiar figure. And then he saw her, Eva. She was at table 5, taking an order from a couple who had been lingering too long over their menus. She smiled politely, her tone soft but confident, and moved with a fluidity that made even the busiest tasks seem effortless. Enzo's admiration was quiet, measured, entirely respectful, but undeniable. She was the embodiment of competence and grace in a world that rarely offered either. Valentina noticed his gaze immediately. "Who are you looking at?" she asked, her voice sharp enough to draw his attention back to her. Enzo's smile was calm, almost imperceptible. "No one in particular, just appreciating the atmosphere and the service," he added, letting the last word linger, knowing full well how it would sound to someone like Valentina. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't speak for a moment, letting the silence grow. Then she leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice. "You seem interested in that waitress." Enzo chuckled lightly, a sound that carried both warmth and restraint. "Interested in her work, yes. Not in her personally. She's efficient, polite, and professional. Qualities I admire." Valentina's eyes narrowed, her hands folding neatly on the table. "I see," she said, but the sharpness in her tone betrayed her. She didn't like being reminded that someone else could capture even a fragment of his attention, no matter how innocent. Eva, unaware of the tension brewing at the table across the room, continued her rounds, moving from one table to another with practiced skill. Her presence had a magnetic quality. Customers responded to her kindness and attentiveness, often lingering longer than they intended simply to enjoy her energy. Yet she remained focused, never distracted, never swayed by the hustle and bustle around her. Enzo signaled subtly to the waiter, requesting Eva personally. It was a small gesture, one meant to honor her competence and maintain a standard he valued highly. When Eva approached their table, she greeted him with her usual calm professionalism, offering a warm smile and a polite, "Good evening, Mr. Romano. How can I help you today?" Valentina's gaze sharpened at the interaction. She noted the ease between them, the familiarity that Enzo displayed without crossing boundaries. Her mind raced, a swirl of irritation and envy mixing with curiosity. Why did he treat her differently from everyone else? Why did he notice her, acknowledge her in ways he rarely did with anyone else? Enzo's instructions were clear but courteous. He asked for the dishes he preferred, spoke briefly about the ingredients, and complimented her attentiveness in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. Ava listened carefully, responding with patience and poise, never letting the situation tilt toward awkwardness or discomfort. Valentina, meanwhile, felt the jealousy tightening like a knot in her chest. She kept her composure, but her mind was a storm. She had always been the center of Enzo's world, the one who commanded his attention and loyalty. Yet here was a simple waitress, unaware of the world she had stepped into, drawing even a fraction of his admiration simply through her personality and professionalism. The meal progressed slowly, with Enzo occasionally engaging Eva in brief, respectful conversation. He asked about the specials, complimented her recommendation, and even shared a quiet joke about a particularly chaotic lunch service earlier in the week. Eva laughed lightly, her tone warm but reserved, never allowing the interaction to overstep any boundaries. Valentina's eyes followed every movement, every exchange. The jealousy simmered beneath the surface, turning into a quiet anger that she couldn't quite express. She sipped her wine, her fingers drumming lightly on the table, and forced herself to smile politely at Enzo, though the tension between them was palpable. It was in these small moments, the glance, the subtle smile, the way Enzo acknowledged Eva's skill without overstepping, that the story of conflict began to take shape. Valentina's ego, accustomed to being the singular focus of her husband's attention, clashed with the reality that Enzo could admire someone else for qualities he respected, without it being a threat to her position or their relationship. As the main course arrived, Eva continued her work seamlessly, delivering dishes to other tables while keeping an eye on their table for any need or request. Enzo's subtle admiration never faltered. It was not flirtation, not romantic in nature, simply respect for competence and integrity. Valentina, on the other hand, found herself increasingly restless. She shifted in her chair, glanced around the restaurant as if searching for a way to assert dominance or control over the situation. She was used to commanding attention, used to being the center of influence in every room she entered. Yet here, in the calm, professional environment of La Rosa, she felt powerless. By the time dessert was served, the tension had grown thick enough that it almost hummed in the air. Enzo maintained his calm demeanor, speaking softly to Eva, appreciating her work, acknowledging her professionalism. Valentina, meanwhile, masked her jealousy behind a veneer of polite conversation, though the subtle sharpness in her tone didn't go unnoticed by Enzo. The night had set the stage. The interactions were subtle, understated, yet the emotional undertow was undeniable. Enzo's admiration for Eva, purely grounded in respect for her abilities and character, had ignited a quiet jealousy in Valentina, a feeling she had rarely, if ever, experienced. And though nothing had erupted into confrontation yet, the seeds were planted. The tension was ready to boil over, the dynamics ready to shift dramatically, setting the course for events that would soon leave La Rosa, and everyone within it forever changed. The soft hum of conversation and clinking cutlery filled the warm, ambient air of La Rosa. Enzo excused himself quietly, nodding politely to Eva as he rose from the table. "I'll be back in a moment," he said smoothly. He walked toward the restroom, his composed demeanor masking the anticipation he always carried. He needed a brief moment to freshen up, calm his mind, but the timing couldn't have been worse for what was about to unfold. Valentina's eyes followed him, her pulse quickening, not from worry, but from the dark thrill of opportunity. She had observed the easy rapport between Enzo and Eva all evening, the way he had praised her professionalism, and it had gnawed at her pride. Now, with Enzo momentarily out of sight, the stage was hers. She straightened her posture, a sly smile curling at the corners of her lips. "Excuse me," she called softly across the restaurant, summoning Eva with the politest possible tone, masking the tension behind a veneer of civility. "Could you bring me some water, please?" Eva, ever professional, approached the table with a smile. "Of course, Ms. Romano," she said, holding the carafe carefully. Her hands were steady, her eyes calm, unaware of the storm simmering just beneath the surface of the wealthy woman sitting before her. Valentina's smile remained fixed, but her mind worked quickly. As Eva leaned slightly forward to pour water into Valentina's crystal glass, she shifted subtly, guiding the carafe in a way that caused the liquid to spill across the fine silk of her dress. Eva froze, horror spreading across her face. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she stammered, her hands instinctively reaching to steady the glass. Valentina's reaction was immediate, loud, and dramatic. She gasped, her voice rising like a whip cracking through the restaurant. "What do you think you're doing?" she shouted, her tone dripping with feigned fury. Do you have any idea how much this dress costs? The other diners turned their heads, some startled, others subtly entertained by the escalating scene. Eva's heart pounded in her chest. She had only meant to serve, to do her job. And yet she now found herself the target of a wealthy woman's temper. I didn't mean to, she tried to explain, her voice small and apologetic, but Valentina cut her off. Valentina's hand lashed out in frustration, gripping at the fabric of Eva's uniform. "You careless little," she screamed, tearing at the apron and shirt as her anger consumed her. The restaurant seemed to freeze in that moment, the clatter of utensils, the hum of conversation. Even the waiters nearby paused. Unsure how to intervene, Eva struggled, her hands raised instinctively to protect herself. Her cheeks burned with humiliation, her eyes wide with fear and disbelief. She couldn't comprehend the audacity of this woman, the sudden eruption of unchecked rage over something so trivial and so deliberately orchestrated. And then, just as Valentina's fury reached its peak, a tall, commanding figure appeared at the edge of the scene. Enzo. He had returned from the restroom, fresh and composed, only to find chaos where he had left calm. His eyes, dark and intense, took in the scene. The torn uniform, Eva's trembling form, and Valentina's chest heaving as she glared at the waitress. For a moment, he said nothing, allowing the weight of his presence to settle over the table. Valentina's head snapped toward him, expecting perhaps a dismissal, a mild rebuke, but nothing could have prepared her for the force in his gaze. Enzo stepped forward, each movement measured, authoritative yet calm. Without a word, he reached out and gripped her hand tightly, the pressure firm and unyielding. "I saw everything," he said, his voice low but carrying through the room like thunder beneath velvet. The words cut deeper than any shout or tear, freezing Valentina in place. Her eyes widened, a mixture of shock and guilt flooding her expression. "Enzo," she began, her tone faltering, unsure how to respond to the intensity of his stare. "You thought you could act without consequence," Enzo continued, his voice steady but charged with controlled fury. "You humiliated her, a girl who has done nothing but show kindness, patience, and respect. And for what? Because she dared to exist in a way that drew my attention?" Valentina's grip on her own composure faltered. The wine of privilege and arrogance that had fueled her rage moments ago began to drain away, leaving only raw vulnerability. I didn't," she stammered, but her words rang hollow against the weight of Enzo's presence. Enzo's eyes softened slightly, but the steel of authority remained. "I expect better from you. Not because of me, but because of who you are. And if you cannot control yourself, there will be consequences." His grip on her hand didn't loosen, a reminder of both restraint and absolute power. Valentina sank back into her chair, her anger extinguished by the realization that she had been witnessed, judged, and held accountable. Her jealousy, her manipulation, her cruelty, all laid bare before the man whose respect she craved most. Eva, still trembling, straightened as she watched the exchange. Enzo's gaze softened briefly as it met hers, an unspoken apology for the ordeal she had endured. "You did nothing wrong," he said quietly, ensuring that only she could hear. The words were small, yet they carried immense weight, validating her professionalism and dignity in the face of unwarranted humiliation. The restaurant staff, though initially frozen, began to breathe easier as the tension shifted. The patrons whispered quietly among themselves, glancing between the tables, sensing the quiet authority that had just reasserted order without chaos, without violence beyond the storm of words and presence. Valentina lowered her eyes, still gripping Enzo's hand as though it anchored her in reality. For the first time that evening, she felt the sting of accountability, the clear understanding that privilege and power did not excuse cruelty. Enzo released her hand slowly, letting the weight of the lesson settle. He turned slightly, giving Eva a reassuring nod. "I'll handle this," he said softly yet firmly, before returning his attention to Valentina. "Learn from it. Control yourself, or you'll find that respect and power are far more fragile than you think." The moment was electric, a balance of fear, respect, and realization. The storm had passed, but its echoes would linger. Eva, though shaken, felt a quiet surge of relief. She had survived not through confrontation, but through restraint, professionalism, and the silent support of a man who recognized her worth. Valentina, meanwhile, sat in stunned silence, the fire of arrogance replaced by the cold recognition that her actions had been witnessed and judged. And for Enzo, the night had proven something simple yet profound. Respect, patience, and integrity commanded more authority than wealth, rage, or manipulation ever could. The tension in La Rosa hung thick in the air, slowly dissipating as the reality of the moment sank in. Valentina sat frozen, her chest heaving, eyes wide as she processed Enzo's calm but unyielding authority. Eva, her uniform torn and her dignity tested, stood trembling, unsure of how to recover from the humiliating ordeal. But Enzo's presence offered an unspoken shield. Without a word, Enzo moved closer to Eva. He removed his tailored coat and draped it gently over her shoulders. The weight of the fabric was both practical and symbolic. It covered her exposed chest. Yes, but it also represented protection, respect, and acknowledgement. "Here," he said quietly, his voice soft but firm. "You don't deserve this." Not from her, not from anyone. Eva's eyes filled with tears, part relief, part gratitude, as she adjusted the coat around her. Thank you, Mr. Romano," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Enzo gave her a reassuring nod, then turned his gaze back to Valentina. She shrank slightly under his stare, the fire of her earlier arrogance replaced by shame and frustration. Words failed her, and for once, she realized that control and wealth could not shield her from consequences, especially when facing someone who valued integrity over intimidation. The rest of the evening passed in strained silence. Valentina remained at the table, simmering in anger and embarrassment, while Enzo and Eva completed the meal with quiet dignity. When the time came to leave, Enzo ensured Eva's shift concluded smoothly before stepping out into the cool night air. His coat folded neatly, the memory of the confrontation lingering. That night, and many nights afterward, the incident remained a turning point, not just for Eva, but for the dynamics of Enzo and Valentina's marriage. Enzo respected her for her resilience, patience, and professionalism, qualities Valentina had tried and failed to suppress through manipulation and jealousy. And over the years, the tension that night became a seed for growing conflict between Enzo and Valentina. Despite Valentina's wealth, charm, and influence, the cracks in their marriage widened. Enzo valued integrity, respect, and loyalty, qualities that Valentina consistently failed to demonstrate. Arguments escalated over time, each more intense than the last, fueled by a lingering memory of that restaurant evening. The clash between pride and principle became irreconcilable. Years later, Enzo made a decision that would shock many in their social circle, but not those who truly understood him. He filed for divorce, ending the marriage with Valentina not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. She had revealed her true priorities: ego, jealousy, and a willingness to humiliate others to feel power. Enzo, however, could not compromise his values, and the union that had once appeared flawless was finally dissolved. Eva's life continued, transformed subtly by that fateful night. She remained at La Rosa, her professionalism untouched, her dignity intact, and even more respected by the regulars and staff alike. Enzo occasionally visited, not as a man caught in temptation, but as a figure of quiet mentorship and acknowledgement. He never interfered in her life beyond what was appropriate, but his respect and validation were evident, quietly shaping her confidence and opportunities. Valentina, on the other hand, carried the weight of both humiliation and loss. That night in the restaurant, and Enzo's firm, unshakable stance, haunted her long after the torn silk and spilled water were forgotten by the casual observers. She realized too late that wealth and arrogance could never replace respect, patience, or character. In the end, the restaurant incident became more than just a scandalous evening. It became a symbol of power, integrity, and accountability, where the real triumph was not in wealth or status, but in the quiet courage and professionalism of a young waitress. and the unwavering principles of a man who refused to condone cruelty, even from the person he once called his wife.